lot of things, but it ain't.
It's pretty close to what you want. Yes. Yeah. And I did my master's in geography, so I know. Although the campus has changed so much. Elliott School.
Oh, that's nice. Oh, I hadn't realized that you were in the Elliott School in London.
I am both, actually. Oh, I'm both. Okay, yeah, because I thought you would be. Yeah, no, but I'm actually going to, I have a new office at the Elliott School. Directly into there.
Great.
My office. Right, well, that fancy building was not there when I did my master's there. Oh, you have master's degree?
Oh my God.
That is not the famous Yeah, that would be great.
So we have charge. No, actually, I felt like
Tell the national security people this, but courses were actually some of the most recent things I did in the master's.
I did it mid-career, and so honestly,
They really are the Latins of Asia.
And, and this was at a phase where they were trying to go and so the politics was not a learn it, but getting a chance to go back and reinsert an economic foundation into the great. You should tell already. We have a new game. Really nice.
All right, let's get John up here.
Well, and just because there's such a terrible problem with lack of cross-pollination, as this
Corral.
panel is going to show, you have to be able to talk about both pieces.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a lot of overlap in conception these days.
And the conversation is so stupid because people can't talk about both pieces. So that, to me was the real advantage.
Right.
Good to see you again.
It is a total pleasure.
Oh my God, there have been so many panels since I saw you yesterday.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome.
Frank doing here?
Today is Friday, April 14th. It's 11 a.m. And this is the panel on trade deals, job creators, job killers, or strategic imperatives. I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones, as I'm sure you've been asked in every other panel you've been at. And you probably also know that you can submit questions via the CWA app on your phone. And we also have a producer here who has some note cards that we'll hand out if you'd prefer to write your questions. So please submit questions. Thank you all for joining us today and joining this panel. My name is Rita Mahoney. My background is in international development, intercultural training, and executive coaching. Most recently, I've been a country director for the Peace Corps in Azerbaijan, Moldova, and I've just returned from helping to open a Peace Corps post in Myanmar, which is our newest addition.
Fantastic.
So, yeah. So it is a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce you to our illustrious panel that we have today. I think it's going to be a very lively and informative panel that we have today. You have your bios in the program. I'm not going to read through that, but I'll give you just a quick kind of summary of who you have the good fortune of hearing from today. So to my left, I have Larry Greenwood. He's an Asian expert specializing in Japan, Southeast Asia, and economics. We thank him for presenting at least 8 different panels that I've seen. So it seems that all of these people have been working quite a bit this week. He's the current president of the Japan Society of Northern California, and he supported U.S. Negotiators in the TPP negotiations, so I think he'll have some really insightful comments. He previously worked in corporate government relations in Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, and served as VP at the ADB, at the Asia Development Bank in Manila. He's also been a diplomat with the State Department in the Philippines, Japan, Singapore, Senegal, and was ambassador to APEC before moving to a deputy secretary role with State. So perhaps he'll give us some insights on his views of State and what's happening there. That's quite a God knows. To the left of him, we'd like to welcome back to Boulder Professor Maggie Chen. She received her PhD and master's from Boulder and currently is at George Washington University. She's an expert in economics. and international affairs. Her research expertise includes international trade, which focuses on behaviors and impact of multinational and export firms in the global economy. She was a trade policy advisor to the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, where she led policy analysis on TPP and has served as an economist for the World Bank. So we're thrilled to welcome her back to Boulder. And to the left of her, please join me in welcoming Heather Hulbert. She's currently the Director of New Models for Policy Change at New America, and I think she's probably helped put a few cracks in the glass ceiling in D.C. She was the only woman on Secretary Madeleine Albright's speechwriting staff. She also is a speechwriter for President Clinton as well as Secretary Christopher. Her specialty is on national security. So I think she will bring a really unique perspective, and we are just very happy that she's here in this time of political polarization. Her current position is providing guidance to advocates and funders trying to find influence in helping political outcomes in D.C. So lots of luck to you on that one. And finally, we think we'll have some sparks flying with John Nichols. Some of you I know are following him around to all the panels that he's been at this week. He is a national affairs correspondent with The Nation. He's also, maybe you see him in your living rooms or hear him in your car. He is a contributor to the BBC, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, and other media outlets. We could go on and on. He's the author of many articles and books. One that I liked, particularly the name of, was a biography of Dick Cheney, and it is entitled Dick, the Man Who...
You don't even have to say the rest, do you? Yeah.
Oh, there's more? Dick, the Man Who is President. John also has been on 8 panels and will be doing his 9th panel at 2 o'clock today on the media elected Trump, but he still hates them. So thank you all. The way that this will go is we will have each of our panelists will have about 10 minutes to introduce themselves in relationship to the topic that we're talking about today. Then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion with all of the panelists, and I'll be asking some questions of them. And then we'll have at the remainder of the session about 20 minutes for your questions. So please submit them, and we will make sure that you have them. And I promise you we will get you out of here on time. So with that, if I can turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll talk as an economist, I guess, and as a former trade guy mainly about the job creation / job losses, and I'll kind of do them together. And it is going to be the standard analysis, which I think most people are familiar with, but wasn't in fact the theme of the campaign on both sides, and that is, free trade agreements and free trade generally result in small increases in job creation, and I say small because they're not particularly large here in the United States, but they actually do result in a large redistribution of the kinds of jobs that are created from those that are lower paying to those that are higher paying. So we create a lot of new, better jobs through trade, but the total net increase of jobs is relatively small. And the reason for that in the United States is that we actually, the international trade as a percentage of our GDP is relatively small. It's only 20-some%. I think in all this talk about globalization, we kind of forget that we're one of the least globalized countries on earth. And so it's certainly among the OECD, we're one of the least. And it's just partly not because we're not open, because we have actually one of the more open markets. We're a continental economy. We're a big, gigantic continental economy that actually can produce a lot for ourselves, and it's transportation and proximity. Geography does matter in trade, even with lower transport costs because of container shipping and all the other things that we've seen. It still does matter. Distance does matter, and so you don't have trade does not play the kind of role in the United States that it plays, for example, in Singapore. Vietnam, for example, has trade is over 100% of their GDP. China is also not a particularly globalized economy. Their trade as a percentage of GDP is not that different from the United States. So it's just one thing to keep in mind. So when we look at the impact of something like a free trade agreement on the United States, because trade plays a relatively small part, not small, it's been important. I mean, 27% is still an important part of our economy. It's not going to result in the kind of job impact that it would in Vietnam, for example. And so just that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, one of the problems with that kind of factor is that it's hard then to make the argument. So when politicians are making the arguments, or our presidents are making the arguments for free trade agreements like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they tend to focus on job creation on the export side of the agenda. So we are creating more export jobs, and those export jobs are higher paying, as I mentioned before. But they tend to overpromise, and that was my experience, and it's been the experience in for example, NAFTA and the Uruguay round. When the U.S. Congress passed the Uruguay round and NAFTA, which was basically around the same time in the mid-90s, and I was involved in writing the talking points. President Clinton, had made promises of these vast increases of, net job increases that were going to come out of these agreements. And we put them in, and my economist would come to me and say, Larry, this is BS. You know this, right? And I said, yeah, but it's too hard to tell people they should support this because it means cheaper prices and everyone is going to be better off. Because for some reason, voters don't seem to care about the fact that they could lower prices. They just care about the pain and there is real pain of some people who lose their jobs to import competition, even though it's a small number. And so, that political dynamic has been a problem because essentially we've made promises we couldn't keep in terms of we, meaning the government. They made promises they couldn't keep in a sense of trade projection, net job creation projections that were in fact unrealistic. And frankly, that's how we were selling TPP as well. We sold it, jobs. Basically, it was jobs. China, kind of strategic China. I don't want to use the word containment, but that we have a China leadership issue, and exports, but no mention of imports and the benefits that Americans get from imports. So I just mentioned that. So when we talk about job creation, again, we just have to be realistic. It's going to have an impact. It's going to be positive. It's just not going to be as big as everyone talks about. We do get a lot of, and again, it is important, the fact that we're going to be creating more export markets. And also, we shouldn't downplay the impact that free trade has on emerging economies. Globalization and trade was an important part of the China's success, and this is, China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty over the last 20 years, and that's the biggest anti-poverty step in the history of mankind. And so that shouldn't be sneezed at, and something that we played a part in it by being part of that trading system that helped China do this major important thing. The fact that this free trade is, and this kind of gets to the strategic part perhaps, is it benefits us as an economy as well, but it benefits even more our trading partners and countries where we want to see economic success because that's important for our security. And let me just end then with a couple of other thoughts on the strategic side, but just real quickly, and that is that free trade agreements can also be used to advance other kinds of agenda that may not be directly linked to trade. One example would be, or two examples are environment and labor. Labor standards and environmental standards are now required by law in the United States of all of our free trade agreements, bilateral and multilateral. And that has, it helped advance increasing standards in our labor and environmental standards in our trading partners. And also, we are also obligated under these agreements. It also maybe helps us against any backsliding we might have here. Trade agreements can be used to advance goals such as open internet, data transfer, the ability to have more open information and flows between countries. TPP, that was an important provision. it's unfortunate that we're stepping back from that, but hopefully we'll get there in another way. But this is that's an important, I think, goal for the United States to see this, the open the internet and freedom of moving of information, both for business as well as for social reasons, and that can be advanced by trade agreements such as TPP. Let me stop there and just look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah, okay. So in case it's not self-evident, I'm from China. I grew up in a small coal mining town in the south. It's like kind of like Golden here, without the beer part. It's barely on the map. I never found my hometown on the map before. With only 1.8 million population. That's a small town.
That's a state here.
My father was sent to that town when he was 14 years old. He was originally from a bigger city. During the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to work in a coal mine at 14. So he worked there for a few years. Eventually got out of there and then went to college at the age of 28, I think. And then in the 1990s, my hometown, went through massive unemployment. The coal mine was not getting any good coal out of it. And the country went through massive privatization, was facing a lot of competition, both domestic competition from the private sector, where the economy went from being controlled, 85% of the economy was controlled by the state, to mostly private in a very short period of time. And it was also facing foreign competition and all that. So the unemployment rate, the conservative number, was 20 or probably more %. So a lot of SOEs, state-owned enterprises, went bankrupt, including the mines and other companies like that. And the companies were just sold, on the market. And then a lot of people became unemployed. And they felt like their companies were not sold at a fair deal. They decided to sue in some of the cases. And they hired my dad. My dad went to get a law education. So they hired my dad, and they lost their jobs. The whole family lost their jobs because they worked for the same company most of the time. And overnight, there was nothing at home, to start dinner, basically. It was really bad. And they had nothing to offer to my dad unless he wins the cases. So he represented a lot of these cases. And he won in some cases, and he lost in some cases. But, that's something that sounds a little bit familiar, right? Massive unemployment, right? Coal mining shutting down, we call that Rust Belt, but we didn't have that term in China at that time. And then just a side note, my family got a lot of threats in that period. My brother, who was about 5 at that time, took full advantage of that. So not the threat, but the guys who hired my dad offered to bodyguard us. And my brother really enjoyed that. Private bodyguards in his kindergarten. He started bullying other kids. It's just a side note. But anyway, so it was a very painful transition. Something that was not stressed enough in the media. It sounds like China just went, from experienced fast growth, right? Very smooth growth. And that's not really the reality. China went through massive unemployment, a lot of transformation, But what was important during that transition, that painful transition, was the availability of social security net, the safety net, and good education. Okay, so my town had very good public schools. We went through public schools, we got good education. I went to Beijing for college and went to the United States, Colorado, Boulder, for grad school. So, that's how you achieve social mobility, right? Something I mentioned in my last panel, the Great Gatsby curve. That's how you move from one generation of low income, low education to another, to next generation of high income and high education. And the key for that is not to stop privatization, is not to stop globalization, is to supplement that with the provision of public goods that's easily accessible across the society. And that, to me, is what is missing in our society now, here in the United States. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, right? A lot of things have happened in those decades since 1990s. China joined WTO, that was the China shock, right? And then U.S. joined NAFTA, and a lot more trade agreements were formed, right? That's why we have this trade deal conversation. So a lot of people are skeptical about WTO now. In fact, WTO has been stalled, since the Doha round. But the truth is, something that we forget is the U.S. actually set a lot of rules in WTO. U.S. was actually the one who set the rules in WTO, or the GATT, the early version of WTO. And guess who used WTO the most? Or who was sued the most? Both, actually, same answer. It's the United States. U.S. actually uses WTO aggressively to protect the interests of our producers. And U.S. also gets sued a lot. And U.S. lost in a lot of these lawsuits. And the U.S. sued China a lot, actually more than 20 times since 2001. And in that case, actually, U.S. won most of these cases. So that's something I think we often don't, is underplayed. WTO existed because we use that to protect our industries, to safeguard the industries, to make that transition more smooth and less painful. And there's a couple more misconceptions out there. One is about trade deficit, how important trade deficit is. First of all, I think bilateral trade deficit is overstated. And so there is an aggregate trade deficit, which the U.S. has, and bilateral trade deficit that U.S. has with China and many other countries, including Mexico and Vietnam and so on. And so for example, this is actually an example from my colleague, Jay Shambal. So I run a trade deficit with almost everybody in my life. My hairdresser, my plumber, my electrician, right? The restaurants I go to. Why? Because I cannot get them to consume my services. They're not interested in taking courses from me, right? Does that mean I should be worried about my trade deficit with my hairdresser? Should I start cutting my own hair? No, I will not do that, right? I will not do my hair. But, so obviously this is not a perfect analogy. This is very imperfect because, I'm not worried about losing my job to my hairdresser, which is fine, but demonstrates some point, So it's natural to have bilateral trade deficit. If anything is meaningful, perhaps let's look at aggregate trade deficit. If I run an aggregate trade deficit with everybody, right, I'm just spending more than I make. Yes, maybe I should look at my personal finance. I should start saving more. Maybe I should, upgrade my skills, to get myself a better paid job, right? And maybe I should, just to change my, my production strategy or my occupation or my skills. Obviously, that's not going to be easy, but that's probably more important than worrying about every single bilateral trade deficit you run. So one last thing I want to say is, trade deals today, are not just about liberalizing the marketplace. Okay, trade deals are far more than economic agreement or trade agreement. Trade deals often are about, lending stability, helping us get the stability we don't have otherwise, in national security, in politics, and to avoid a chaotic and volatile world economy. And that's something I think we need to understand. If we just walk away from trade or trade deals, there might be other unintended consequences. And I think it's naive to think that revamping or backing off our trade agreements or trade globalization will be will save the jobs we are losing. I think there are a lot of other causes that we are not looking into. Trade can be one of them, but might not be the most important cause.
Thank you, Maggie. That could hardly have set up better for me if we'd planned it in advance.
We did plan for 2 minutes.
And I also will say this is my 8th and last panel of the 2017 CWA, so thank you all very much. This guy who's got another panel this afternoon, that's the real, now we know who the really hardcore people are. But as Maggie and Larry both mentioned, there are often non-economic reasons given for why we should or shouldn't do trade deals. And in the most recent debate around the TPP in the U.S., it became apparent that a lot of people were invoking security either as a reason to do trade deals or not do them, but in a really kind of not very well-informed way. So I want to do sort of a brief history of how security plays in trade deals, and which might suggest how we think about it in the future. So actually, the idea that Maggie just referenced, that trade is tied to stability and peace in international relations, was very much on the minds of the founders of the American Republic. And Ben Franklin, among others, really believed that, I mean, in part out of the experience of our British colonial masters restricting whom we could sell to, really saw the young republic's ability to go far and wide in its economic relations and not be dependent in any way on Britain, and nor be caught up in rivalries between, at the time, Britain and France, was essential to the country's ability to develop. Now that we are all fans of Hamilton, we know, maybe more than those of us who aren't economists would have known in the background, that the founding fathers did argue about just how open the economy should be, and just how much trade there should be. But it is interesting to note that both the Jeffersonians of the agricultural South and the Hamiltonians of the industrial North absolutely counted on being able to sell overseas everywhere. And that was an underlying assumption of the early American project, and that barriers on the free flow of trade were such a severe threat that they were a cause for, or considered a cause for war, and evading them was a primary security objective of the young republic. And that really informs thinking about foreign policy and national security, that perceived connection between trade, economic stability, and peace for our first 200 years. And then, of course, in the early 20th century, you have World War I and World War II, and the lesson that American policymakers take away from this is that both times we get dragged into European and global wars, which start in part because of unrestrained European economic and trade competition. And so American thinkers coming out of World War II, I mean, between the wars as well, although between the wars we had our own set of debates about this, which in some ways are interesting parallels to the ones we're having now. But coming out of World War II, American policymakers look around and say, really, Europe, we are not going to let you do that to us again. A. And B, on top of that sort of old historical thinking about trade openness leading to security, you also have the question of a bipolar ideological combat, which is perceived to have both a security and an economic context. And so the idea of open and free zones of trade with countries that are either already on our side against the Soviet Union or that we want to be on our side against the Soviet Union, it's frankly perceived that economic benefits and economic costs, as Larry referenced them, come second to the priority, which is building zones that won't go to war with each other and that are tied together as reliable allies against our geopolitical opponent. And that strategy actually, for the purpose for which it was designed, prevent another European war and defeat the Soviet Union, it worked really well. It had other downsides and upsides that we can certainly talk about, but for what its architects wanted it to do, it was great. And not only was it great for the US, it was great for Europe, it was great for Japan, it was great for Korea. So there's a whole generation where this sort of building security through trade, and where necessary, opening the US economy, as Larry said, even a little further than in many cases American producers would have preferred, and saying, well, there's a security imperative that we have to let Japan sell cars here. That argument seems to pay off really well in security terms for a whole half century, where we certainly have very significant trade tensions. You do have significant regional costs in the US, where there are whole regions that perceive themselves to have been devastated by trade. But from a security perspective, you know, we lived through a half century of peace, prosperity, and American hegemony unlike anything that the world had ever seen. And as you referenced, Maggie, in your very affecting anecdote at the beginning of your remarks, and boy, it's hard for an American to hear that from a non-American, so thank you, of unprecedented social mobility. So that was a period where a combination of conditions actually worked well, and we were able to make what classic economics would tell you were economic sacrifices for security ends, and they weren't felt as unbearable economic sacrifices. And frankly, our national security decision-making structure kind of got used to that framework. And certainly through the time that I got my undergraduate and graduate educations, that was taught as that's how it works. That is the orthodoxy of how it works. The U.S. can make economic sacrifices on trade, and that will work out as a net benefit for us, both in the security realm and in the economic realm. And now we come to the end of the Cold War, and frankly, by this time I'm in the policymaking space, so I have to take some responsibility for this. We transfer this idea to a whole new set of circumstances and a whole new set of countries. And we say, oh, well, if we bring China into the WTO, that will have the same effect on China that it had on Japan and on South Korea and on the European nations after World War II. And not only will China modernize its economy, and not only, although I have to say I don't think anyone imagined that China would make quite the strides against poverty that it did, but also we thought China will, quote unquote, modernize its political system in a way that we like and in a way that will be conducive to peaceful relations with us. So if you cast your mind back to the 90s, and I was in the Clinton White House during PNTR, we sincerely believed that negotiating normal trade relations with China and helping China and Russia get into the WTO would improve our security situation. Similarly, if you remember the negotiation of NAFTA and CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, they were sold, in addition to, as Larry said, some possibly overblown promises on the economic side, they were going to be all about hemispheric integration on the security side. And you know, I'll let you judge for yourself the China-Russia picture. I don't need to talk about that. The hemispheric picture is mixed in an interesting way, because it is absolutely true that government-to-government security cooperation up and down our hemisphere is far better than they were before NAFTA and CAFTA were signed. And, you know, in many ways at the sort of highest level, you know, thinking about terrorism, we have an incredibly peaceful hemisphere. And there's no question that the economic foundations of NAFTA and CAFTA developed relationships among officials who had been historically quite adversarial to one another, and that NAFTA and CAFTA, at times where there were very tense disagreements in one sphere, helped keep the two governments cooperating, or the multiple governments cooperating, in ways that are very good for security cooperation. Now, at the same time, no sane person can look at the security catastrophe that has unspooled in Central America, and through Central America affected Mexico, and through Mexico affected us, and say, well, gee, the security situation with respect to the south of the Northern Hemisphere is better than it was before NAFTA and CAFTA. And on the one hand, there's nothing in NAFTA and CAFTA that can help you with the sort of the problems of insecurity, but you know, we did promise that we were going to have better government-to-government ties, and where you have problems that are caused by this unholy trinity of poverty, drugs, coming from the south, and guns coming down from us here in the north, we have not, as three societies, been able to tackle that at all. And so you cannot blame people for saying, well, look, you told us that NAFTA and CAFTA were security agreements, and those countries are ridiculously insecure with very painful consequences for us and for our societies. So then, and Rita actually may have some things to say about this. I love to suck the moderators into the conversation. We also started doing trade deals with developing societies outside our hemisphere and saying, look, this is going to help with security. We're going to give young people jobs in the Middle East, and they're not going to turn to extremist groups. We're going to give young people jobs in Africa, and that's going to help with societal violence. And something I find very interesting on this is there's just not a lot of data one way or the other. There's a lot of opinions one way or the other about whether those trade deals were helpful from a security point of view. But I it's fascinating to me. I just don't see, and if we've got researchers in the room, I would love for folks to go out and work on it. I can't sit in front of you and make a strong argument about how the free trade deal with Jordan, say, helped convince a lot of young Jordanian men not to become extremists, or that the trade deals that we concluded setting up special export zones in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa had helpful impacts on societal violence. So when you get to the TPP, and you have a lot of claims that were made, about how they were going to be helpful stabilizers in places like Vietnam. Well, there's really not good data on that one way or the other, and it's very easy for trade opponents to look at the examples of CAFTA and NAFTA and say, what, are you crazy? This is a terrible idea. The other sort of profound incoherence of TPP on the security side was that you had, as Larry mentioned, you had some Americans saying we needed TPP to contain China, and you had other Americans saying we needed TPP to include China. You know, politics and diplomacy are flexible, but they aren't that flexible. So what all of that suggests to me as a concluding thought is that we still live in a time where the links between economics and security, where the links between economic imperatives and security imperatives are very tight. But they're not tight in the same ways that they were in the 1930s or the 1730s. So going forward, before we get to big trade deals, we are going to have to reconceptualize how it is that a society like China, which is now large enough that it is not going to be sort of easily handled by trade deals with the US, and that is the wrong way to think about them. So you're going to have to reconceptualize and make more modest your goals for security and trade deals, which is always hard for those of us who are addicted to very maximalist rhetoric in our policymaking to do. One last point I want to make, which none of us thought we would be having to talk about 6 to 12 months ago. Set aside everything you think about, should there be more trade deals, should there be a TPP, should there be a TTIP with Europe, and then ask yourself what the history I've just told you suggests about whether it's a smart idea to unwind this structure of international economic relations that we do have. Of whether it's a smart idea to move toward, and you guys are going to have to help me remember the technical term for this, the idea of taxing imports rather than taxing exports. The idea of we seem now to have some in our leadership who think that maybe a little trade war here and there is good for everybody. And one place where I do think history and the nature of economic and security relations has not changed since the founding of the Republic is that you really don't want to start trade wars if you can help it. And so I would suggest that no matter your view, people who are strong supporters of TPP, people who are strong opponents of TPP, should look with great concern at suggestions that the U.S. can unilaterally modify aspects of the international economic system and not pay a security, all of us cannot pay a security price for that.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Brilliant panel. Brilliant things said. I have opposed every trade agreement this country has entered into since 1993 with the NAFTA vote. And I have opposed them with a passion, in an outspoken and I think sometimes relatively prominent way, speaking in the US and more than 25 countries around the world. I have done so because I am an internationalist, because I have a great passion for international cooperation and for international linkage, and I have done so because I am an American who still gets a tear in my eye when our flag comes down the street in a parade. Let me try to explain quickly why I believe what I believe, and why I also think, and this, because of all these wonderful things that have been said and brilliant things that have been said, let me also suggest why our conversation here is largely irrelevant.
Thanks for that, John.
No problem.
Thanks.
Here to serve. I came into the trade debate in a very different way. I didn't come in through the United States, although obviously we've had I loved your presentation, by the way. Thank you. It's so vital. I wish I could take you across this country, because what you told about with your town is the experience of hundreds and hundreds of towns in this country. Unfortunately, we can find them on the map. And they're much smaller than the town you came from, but boy, that is. So I didn't come in that way. I came in, I was raised by a mother who had me reading about the Dalai Lama when I was 6, going to meet the Dalai Lama when I was a little kid, learning Spanish, going to Mexico, walking the borders, traveling around the world. Where I started to get tied into trade issues was in South Africa after 1990 with ANC and other folks as the transition period went on. In Israel, Palestine in the late 80s into the early 90s, in India and other places. And what I heard again and again and again from everyone I met with was, look, we've suffered the worst of colonialism. We've seen colonialism and we've seen what it does. And with the vision of a Vandana Shiva or Martin Corr or others, they said, look, there's a new colonialism coming. They will call it trade. They will call it free trade. And multinational corporations will attach the dollar sign to the American flag, and they will come to our countries, and they will seek to colonize in the same ways as we were colonized by others in the past. I didn't hear this once. I didn't hear this 20 times, 100 times. I heard it thousands of times in townships and in rural communities, and not from always great intellectuals, often from working class people who had a simple, clear vision of the future. But I also heard it from Russ Feingold, who is a Rhodes Scholar, from Sherrod Brown, a Russian scholar, one of the most skilled people on international policy in the world, and a great internationalist, from Marcy Kaptur, the congresswoman from Toledo, a Catholic social justice activist who's traveled the world and examined these issues. And the bottom line is this. Trade is wonderful. There's nothing wrong with trade. Corporate-sponsored and corporate-defined free trade is the same as pollution of the air. Air is fine, but when you corporatize the process, you pollute the air. We have polluted trade policy by handing it off to multinational corporations to be defining forces in what we do. And so let me tell you, it hasn't always been easy, because as somebody who is an internationalist and who's somebody who cares about the rest of the world passionately, I've often, the first thing they say to you is, well, you just don't understand, you're dumb, right? People oppose free trade, they're just not sharp enough to get they haven't drunk enough mineral water, right? Or been in enough rooms above a certain floor in a building. And believe me, there is that's why almost every newspaper editorial page in this country packs free trade, right? Because, I don't want to be with the dumb people that oppose trade. I don't want to be with the backward people, with folks who just want to save their jobs. What's wrong, So, believe me, I know how tough it is. In 1993, when NAFTA was coming up, 2 newspapers in the United States actively opposed the North American Free Trade Agreement. One was the Toledo Blade, and I wrote there. And for that paper, and then in mid-1993, I switched to the Madison Capital Times, and I started writing there. And those were the 2 papers that actively opposed. The numbers are startling. But what's fascinating to me is that what we said back in '92, it's funny, we knew your figures were bad. We knew they were bad. We knew they were inflated. And you know who else knew they were inflated? All these working class people. They all knew it. They knew they were being lied to. And that's why they oppose these deals. And here's the interesting thing that brings us full circle on this. We think something's just happening right now where there's this populist reaction against trade. No, trade is the most democratized, high-stakes issue in the United States of America. It is the issue where grassroots working class people have been educated for decades. And you go into a UAW local in Michigan, you're going to find people that know chapter and verse about trade. They may never have gone to college, but they've got a very clear picture of it. You talk to farmers out in rural Wisconsin, they can tell you about it top to bottom. They may monitor it more closely than many of the experts that promote trade deals. And the same is true of people in Mexico. The same is true of people in Africa. The same is true of people in India and around this world. And the fact of the matter is, if you really believe in free trade, right? If you really believe in a trade regimen that is about making a better world and making peace and making justice and doing anything of value other than making the investor class a whole lot richer, if you really believe in that, then you have to start to reject this madness. The madness of saying there's a new deal that's going to make it better. Because the fact of the matter is you cannot tell that lie to working people again and again and again and expect them to believe you. So Donald Trump didn't create anything. Neither did Bernie Sanders. The fact of the matter is all they did was say it. And when they said it, there were all these people out there who said, yes, of course, we know this to be true. And unfortunately, even now, our media treats these people as fools. It treats them as backward or not quite getting what's going on. That is such a fundamental lie, and is such a fundamentally anti-democratic notion. Trade policy is democratized in the debate. It is not democratized in participation. And because of that, we have created a situation where the only way that people feel they can respond to new trade deals like the TPP or TPIP is to say no. It's the same thing that happened in England with Brexit, right? Where at the end of the day, people who are quite internationalist, who really do love the world, who will shop at a fair trade shop and who will, travel to remote places and give money out of their pockets to help to deal with poverty around the world, will say, they just say, we must say no. We cannot let this thing go on any longer. And so I close off with just this notion. I love trade. I think it's fabulous. But I want to begin an environmental protection policy to trade. I want to clean the air in the trade policy debate. And I want to get the multinational corporations out of the central role that they play. And I want human beings, people across this country and around this world to be central to the debate. I want human rights up front, no question, no debate. I want worker rights up front, no question, no debate. I want environmental protection up front, no question, no debate. And I want democracy up front, no question, no debate. And we did a little this time, we'll get better next time. And if you can't give me that, if you can't promise me that, then I'm going to oppose your next trade deal. And you know what the interesting thing is? There are more and more people of every background and of every belief that are joining me in that opposition. The numbers are rising around the world. And it will become a crisis. It will become a crisis if we don't shift toward a radically different approach to trade. And now the last thing I promised you, and I'm going to close off right here, which is why this is irrelevant. Automation is so radically altering everything with trade policy that the tragic mistakes we made over the last 30 years, which I believe are literally border on immorality at the most fundamental level. But the tragic mistakes we made over the last 30 years are simply the underpinning for where we are at now. And the fact of the matter is, if you travel, I did a book, People Get Ready, about automation, globalization. The fact of the matter is that when you talk with CEOs of auto companies, they say, yeah, we can bring auto plants back to the US. No trouble. We can bring you a plant that used to employ 20,000 people. And if the vectors are right, we're looking at maybe employing in the range of 300 to 600 at that plant. And so what's changing all of this so radically is an automation revolution that is so extreme that the debate we should be having, I'm not trying to get out of this debate because I love it, but the debate we should be having is about how do you create a social and civil society in a automation moment that will be jarring for America and potentially devastating for countries such as China. And we are not having that debate because we didn't have a good debate about trade over the last 30 years. And so, brothers and sisters, if you want to get to the future, we need to shape up our trade debate so that we can begin to have the proper automation debate. Thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you. Well, that was certainly a good intro into the topic. That's not a relevant topic to have, I guess.
I hope you don't take that as anything negative.
So, I mean, we've talked about it from an economic point of view, from a national security point of view, from a democracy and a kind of an equality point of view. And I know that we had some of our panelists making a lot of notes as we were going through all of this. Is there such a thing as an equal trade deal? Is there a model that you would put forward and say these should be kind of, there will be trade, and here, I mean, you talked about some of the things, but, can we say you all need to have a democracy as we define it? That it needs to have these kind of labor laws. I think often we think of free trade as having value towards higher quality goods, protection of our environment, protection of workers are some of the things that people think should be in those trade deals. Can you, I mean, if you were, starting from scratch or when you're negotiating these deals, are there some things that just, you don't negotiate anymore? Like this is kind of the hard stop, right? Whether it is national security or whatever the issue is.
Yeah, well, I think, well, let me start with the non-trade, the non-trade aspects of trade deals. I did mention a few that are in fact in our trade agreements. And it does go to one thing that John said, which as you probably could guess, I agree with almost nothing, other than that automation is a big problem. but
we're ready for that next one then.
Exactly, yeah. And it's when we say that we're not going to, when we have the objective of improving human rights, environmental protection, and labor rights around the world, that's a good objective to have, and I think it's probably been the objective, at least one of the goals of every administration, at least that I've been involved in over 40 years. The question is how you do it, and to say that you're not going to trade with a country that doesn't have the level of human rights, that environmental protection and labor rights that you Americans think is the standard, strikes me as a little arrogant. I mean, Americans are arrogant, and certainly as an American official, I even was arrogant, but that kind of goes even beyond our arrogance. So the real question, I think, for those kinds of issues is how you do it, and you do it by like the way you solve all issues internationally, hard slugs. I mean, you just got to use a lot of different tools. And one of those would be trade agreements. It's not actually going to be the major one because it's a relatively weak tool when it comes to those kinds of things. But it is a tool, and it's the reason we do put labor rights, environmental protection, not human rights to tell you the truth, but those two into our trade agreements and try to push that agenda as far as along as well as we can. Could we do a better job? Could we be more aggressive? Yeah, maybe. But when you're talking about diplomacy, you're sitting down, you're trying to get the other side to agree. And when it comes to equality, equal trade agreements. I mean, this is another question that again was kind of the implication of what John said. That somehow America forced the rest of the world to sign on to these agreements. We forced Mexico to sign into NAFTA. That somehow we are imposing our will on our trading partners. In my negotiations, I can't think of a single case in which I've ever convinced anybody, any other country, to do something that wasn't in their interest. I mean, it's just not something you can do. You can only do that one way, which is by waging war on them. But you can't in diplomacy. You have to convince them that it's in their interest, and you find common ground, and you reach agreement through finding that common ground. And that's what we do in our trade agreements. And so it's, I think, almost by definition, a trade agreement is going to be equal because both sides are going to have to agree that this is in their interest to go forward with that trade agreement. One last thing on democratization of trade, and that is the inputs into the policy debate that goes on in Washington D.C. that formulates what our trade policy is going to be in a particular sector is an important thing, and getting access to that debate is important. Labor unions have very good access to that debate, and there's no question in my mind that they are very capable. They know the issue extremely well, as John has said, and they are very well represented in Washington, and they're very well represented in that policy debate that takes place over where American trade negotiators are going to come out. As are farmers, as are of course, and industry. No question, multinationals have a lot of influence in that policy making process. NGOs have a lot of access, and that access has improved over the years, and I hope under the current administration will continue. That's obviously going to be very important, and we should look for even other ways. I mean, we publish TPP. One of the problems with TPP was that the information was kept very close until it was concluded. It was eventually, of course, now you can read TPP online if you could actually get through it. I mean, if you have insomnia, reading the TPP is one way to take care of it. It's long, it's complicated, but it's there for everyone to take a look at. And so that should have, obviously, that kind of transparency maybe should have been better earlier. Thanks.
So I had the pleasure of going through TPP, the hundreds of pages.
Good for you.
It's not very fun. And I didn't really understand most of the language there, I have to say. I think that my lawyer friends, trade lawyers, would understand the language a lot better. About equal benefits from trade deals, I don't think trade deals or trade was ever supposed to make everybody in a society better off. Trade alone cannot do that. I mean, there are a lot of theories out there suggesting trade and trade deals can make countries, the trading partners, better off at the aggregate level. But there will be winners and there will be losers. It does not mean trade deals are bad or trade is bad. It just means trade alone cannot achieve it. We need trade to be supplemented by other things, other reforms. And so I'm kind of in between. I don't completely disagree with John, but I think it's not, the answer is not to shut down trade deals. It's to actually think about what other things we can do at the same time to make the transition a lot easier. For example, our trade adjustment systems that we have had for a long time, but it's not been very effective in recent years. And going back to WTO, so I just wanted to mention this. It's just, I told this to my last panel, yesterday. When I was a child, my grandma made me listen to the radio. Every morning, I have a tiger grandma. So she, I love her, but I remember this. I don't know why. I just remember this. One morning, I heard this radio telling us in the 80s that the U.S. decided to renew China's most favored nation status, and I remember thinking to myself, "Wow, we are the U.S. most favored nation. That's huge." That was in the 80s. And China probably still not the most favored nation of the United States. I might be wrong, but I don't think we have gone to that point yet. But I mean, so why was that renewed? Actually, why was China in WTO? Why is China in WTO? It's, the U.S. at the time in the 70s, reached out to China, Richard Nixon, because of the triangular relationship with Russia and trying to use China to counteract Russia. And the China-Russian relationship was frozen at that time, so China took the opportunity and established relationship with the United States. And, so hence the MFN status, but all it means is just normal trade relations until, and then 2000, China joined WTO. So now that we are, the U.S. has, at least in the campaign, we hear a lot of criticism about WTO and about how we might want to exit WTO. If the U.S. wants to modify WTO, I can guarantee you there will be a long line of countries, lining up as well, because other people have a lot of concerns and complaints about WTO as well because of the rules the U.S. set in the WTO. So I think wait for our turn, right? So everybody has something to say about WTO, and about TPP. Heather was saying, it's kind of contradicting about some people think TPP is containing China, and some people think TPP might include China. It is contradicting. But if you look at this dynamically, it's not, right? Temporarily, the goal was to contain China's influence in Asia Pacific, and in the long term, however, the possibility of including China is feasible, it's plausible, right? So all these trade agreements are, used temporarily, right? And then with this long-term goal in mind. And I think that has worked in the case of WTO, and was the goal of TPP, at least some of the goals in TPP. And unfortunately, of course, that's already, the history. But But yeah, so I'm going to stop here. Hopefully we'll have more relevant conversations going forward.
I should never have said that, obviously.
So, Ken, to your question, no, for the reasons Maggie said, there is no such thing as a trade agreement that's fair and good for everybody. And another way of saying what Maggie said is that economics is about power and international relations are about power. And trade agreements are a ratification of power relations as they currently stand. And that actually sort of brings me to my biggest critique of John, which is that I totally respect from an advocacy point of view, if you want to use the phenomenon of trade deals to attack the system of global capitalism, that is totally your right. But it's not like you can fix trade deals while still having global capitalism be global capitalism. So just be clear on that. And if you are a policymaker who has decided that it is not the struggle of your life to get rid of global capitalism and replace it with something else, then you have to figure out trade deals that work within the structure of global capitalism. And here I disagree, Larry, I have to say. Unfortunately, and it pains me to say this about an administration that I supported very strongly, but the Obama administration did not maintain the same standards of access to NGO groups, to labor unions, even to members of Congress, frankly, that we had developed in the Clinton administration. So, and this is actually something that we're working on at New America. To your concrete question about what could we do differently, the first thing we can do differently is that trade deals negotiated by the United States of America need to actually have the representation and participation of all relevant sectors that get affected in the U.S. And it is an interesting side note that, labor split on NAFTA. And labor split on the Clinton-era trade deals. And the reason labor split is that labor was in the room. And so, group unions split according to how their members would be affected. Labor did not split on TPP. And the reason for that is the administration didn't try very hard to get them in the room and influence them. And this brings me, I think to my last point where I do agree with some of the thrust of John's critique, which is that trade deals have gone from being actually deals about trade, sort of the things that we all understand as trade, to being, in many cases, deals about finance and deals about fairly arcane and specific factors that you could fairly ask yourself, does the government that I pay for with my taxpayer dollars really need to be helping industry X get a better deal in Thailand or Vietnam? And maybe sometimes the answer is yes, that there are net benefits for the economy as a whole. And maybe sometimes the answer is no. So having I think that the foundation of a better trade policy is, number one, you really make sure everybody is at the table. And number two, that you have a conversation among decision makers about what is the goal of this trade agreement. And then, who are the winners, who are the losers. And then that brings you to the bigger sort of conversation about how do we manage the economy as a whole that you referenced.
Brilliant people always, quickly, because we have questions. All right, people, number one. These are such great people. How can we help but love them? And it's always true with trade. Lovable, good people advance good ideas. But the challenge is that here we are all these years, 30-some years into a globalization regime, and we're still talking about how we get, the relevant every party to the table. We have not, this is what I talk about when I say that if you've got pollution in the process, you got to finally recognize it's there. If in 30 years you can't clean up the stream with all the ways you've been doing it, maybe you ought to try some different approaches. And that's the problem with our free trade regime that we have been under. We have got to break from it. Now, quickly on two other things. The suggestion that it's arrogant of the United States, right? Trust me, it's the opposite of arrogance. There is nothing more arrogant than bartering off my country to multinational corporations and letting them define our policies. That isn't, it's not America going around the world saying, we want this and we want that. It's multinational corporations in those closed rooms without the democratization of the process saying what they want and how they want to come ahead. And so I totally reject the term arrogant on the part of America because I don't think America voted for this thing. I don't think America asked for this. And I think that America is always kept in the dark until the last minute, and they try to pass a trade deal, like it's, oh, we got to do it immediately. We didn't do it up till now. Now we have to do it immediately. Why? Because we don't want you to read it. And the fact of the matter is, the arrogance is on the part of multinational corporations and the advocates of a global free trade regime that has operated in the way that it does. They don't want the people in it. And the interesting thing is that when you bring the NGOs in and when you bring labor in and when you bring people in, by and large, they oppose, right? Because I close with just the simplest thing. Back in 1993 when we were debating NAFTA, Ralph Nader was on TV with a senator from Colorado, a big Republican who was actually a big backer. No, I apologize. Make it right. Debating entry into the WTO, right? And all the documentation on that. Nader's on TV on Larry King's show debating the senator from Colorado who'd been a big advocate for free trade, big advocate for entering the WTO and the whole thing. Nader challenged the guy to read the document. He said, read the document before you vote on this thing. The senator, and I hope I get this right, I think it was Gordon Allen, but I hope I'm right. But this senator read the document on the flight home, read through, looked through, really took a serious look at it. He came back the following week and announced that he was opposed. And this is the bottom line, brothers and sisters. Our members of Congress don't read these things. Our senators don't read these things. Multinational corporations and their lobbyists read these things. And the fact of the matter, they end up as the dominant players. They have created a regime that is damaging to workers in America. It's damaging to workers around the world. Ultimately, it may produce progress, and we may like that progress, but it's not the answer. And if we keep doing it this way, it's the most important thing. We keep doing this way, we're going to have more Trumps and more Le Pens and more Brexits and more of a destabilizing, jarring politics, because those of us who were all of goodwill, as I think everyone on this panel is, those of us who were of goodwill allowed the subterfuges and the lies and the corporate influence to dominate rather than democracy itself.
Right, yeah. I think there's been a lot of discussion about, who gets a seat at the table, and I think we could kind of argue all day, do you need a seat at the table, or has the table been set before people get there with the political system that we have? So just something to reflect on. So one of the questions we have from the audience is, what measures are written into TPT and NAFTA to enforce worker rights and good environmental laws? And how did they get there?
I'm not an expert in this area and on the workers' rights and environment, but let me just take a quick stab at it. Maybe Heather knows more, and John. But basically, the fundamental approach started in NAFTA, which was basically continued into TPP, is that the country involved has to meet, in labor, for example, the ILO standards for the basic labor standards for ILO, or 5 of them, not all of them, because actually the U.S. itself hasn't signed on to the ILO. And but 5 of those standards, one of them includes the ability to be able to have independent unions, and that's always the one that's the most difficult. And that the country has to adopt those and also be committed to enforcing them. And then the same thing pretty much on the environmental side, that the standards have to be a certain minimal standards. It's maybe not great, but that they have to be standards, and that they have to enforce and be seen to be enforcing their minimal standards. If they don't, they could be taken to dispute settlement. Ironically, one of the cases that was, I think, referred to in this panel that was taken against the United States was in fact for our failure to enforce an environmental standard. So it goes both ways, and it's basically to hold all ourselves at a certain standard. Now, I'm not saying that that's the answer to the question, because that's, as I said, this is a hard slog. You just have to find more and more ways of pushing these agendas forward. So that's, I guess, my answer.
Great. Okay, perfect.
So that's government. It's the parties. So the parties to the agreement. In the case of NAFTA, would be the Mexican, American, and Canadian governments. And so one of those governments can bring a case.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's both a positive side and a negative side to that question. And the positive side is that you have seen domestic NGOs pick up these standards and use them as cudgels against their own government, which, of course, is sort of the theory and is what you want. That's the positive side. The negative side you saw with Vietnam in the TPP process, where the Obama administration needed to certify that Vietnam was sufficiently in accord with the ILO standards for the deal to go ahead and be considered. And you know, I mean, these things are always judgment calls, but there was a lot of reason to think that the administration made a certification that it would not have made had it not also wanted the TPP to go ahead. So, you know, so that cuts both ways.
Okay, so another question, and I think we heard a lot about this in the last election cycle. So that says, back in the mid-'70s, my World War II Teamster fathers started saying both parties sold the American worker down the pike. He said this to the day he died 3 years ago. Would you agree?
Totally.
Now, I was gonna I wasn't gonna say this, but I will now. I come from a UAW family. And I am sorry to say that for everything John said about how dishonest the pro-trade case is, and I'm sad I do think there's a lot of truth to it, even, you know, Larry, as you said, the cake gets hyped a little bit. It is also the case that American workers have been told that every bad thing that happened to their jobs and their industries and their communities was because of trade, and it just isn't true. And the tragedy of good and decent people in West Virginia coal mines and in auto factories in Michigan and in steel towns in Pennsylvania, and who sincerely believe that Chinese coal took their jobs or Japanese cars took their jobs or whatever it is, when in fact it is automation and gains in efficiency, changing consumer habits, the failures of American management, and last but not least, the changes in our corporate structure such that corporations are more responsible to Wall Street than to Main Street. All of those factors are at least as important as trade. And, you know, and the left and the unions and my beloved Democratic Party have been complicit in telling Americans an easier story rather than a harder story.
No doubt. So couldn't agree more with that. That's what I was saying in 1992. And the fact of the matter is, this is the bottom line. Politics is about lies. We know that. But the fact of the matter is that the good guys and the bad guys got together and told an awful lot of the same lies for an awful long time. And the fact of the matter is they broke the faith with working class Americans. They absolutely broke the faith. And if you don't believe that, please go out there and talk to these people. The fact of the matter is, you're right. Automation is huge, and on consumer things, all these things are huge. But trade was the issue we put up for debate. Trade was the one that we talked about. Trade was the one where we had these great standoffs where, are you going to vote for NAFTA? Are you going to vote to enter the WTO? Are you going to vote for PNTR? Are you going to vote for all these deals? Trade was the issue we were going to debate, right? And yet we had Democrats at the top level saying, this is going to be great. This is going to work out. And I don't think there was anything that broke the faith of working class Americans with the Democratic Party so much as the approach to trade. And I will tell you this, Donald Trump is going to screw him over again. And this is a huge, important thing to understand. And I worry about this. I genuinely worry for my country. Because now we got somebody who kind of sort of got elected promising to fix this thing. And he isn't going to do it. You look at what's happening this week. The Goldman Sachs guys are rearranging the offices. And I promise you, until the Democratic Party gets its head wrapped around this thing as a small d democracy issue that must be addressed with honest language and honest approaches, and the same with automation, until that happens, we are going to continue to be in an incredibly volatile political moment. It will not get better until somebody stands up and tells the truth. You can do your politics, but I really can't. This is a big deal, people. It's a big deal. Trump is president of the United States for a lot of reasons, gender, race. We cannot deny any of this. But understand that where that margin call is made, in too many of the states, what were the states that flipped from 2008? Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, industrialized states that went through the experience of NAFTA, PNTR, all these other things, and that were looking at the TPP at the moment that they were considering the vote. Don't deny the political reality any longer.
Larry, you look like you have a comment to make.
I do. Yeah, I mean, I guess
Heather has a few comments to make.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go. I'd go into the Teamsters, but it's a long story, and there was actually a very specific Teamster issue that came up in NAFTA, which had to do with opening up the border to allow Mexican truckers to come in, and that was a 10-year delay in our meeting our commitment to that. Which, despite the fact that Mexicans had gleaming brand new trucks, the safest trucks, safer than our own trucks, were not allowed to come in because Teamsters were against it. I'm not sure if that's such a great thing or not. So, but let's not go there. Let me just make one point, I guess, about the alternative to free trade. Because we're debating one now, so we have, I mean, even though actually I'm not totally against the border adjustment tax, but we're talking about a 20% tax on imports. So those same people that live in Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, who are concerned about trade impact on their jobs, are also going to be, I think, very much opposed to paying a 20% Walmart tax. And so, the alternative is higher prices for American consumers. So if we're going to get rid of NAFTA, if we're going to put a tax on imports, we have to be ready to pay for that. And maybe that's part of the retransformation if we get there. But I don't think we're going that direction, because also looking at the polling for free trade is not that when you actually do it's true that the kind of the anti-trade voices are getting higher, but I think it's still more than 50% of people support the concept. They don't necessarily support TPP, but they support the concept of free trade. And
I support the concept.
Being able to buy trade, to have goods and technologies come from all the best from around the world. So it's not so much against free trade. You're saying it's against the way we do it with the way that the lobbyists interact. And yes, maybe there's ways to open that up. I didn't realize that because I wasn't living in the States during the Obama administration. I was living in Japan and the Philippines. I wasn't aware that they didn't have that kind of access that we had in the Bush and the Clinton administrations.
So I want to just add one thing. I think trade has been an easy target, has been a scapegoat for many things. And when the economy is in turmoil, we tend to either look outward or we look backward. Mm-hmm. And we try to reverse things, right? But the point that might be missing, is things have evolved. We are in a different time, right? So if we were busy redoing our deals, and other countries will move on. Other countries will move on with their own deals. So the right counterfactual is not the past. The right counterfactual to look at, the right benchmark to look at is, what if we did not act and the other countries did? Would we be better off then? So I think we have to get our benchmark straight when we make decisions about trade deals.
Okay, so, yeah, please, go ahead.
Are you going to ask us another question?
Oh, go ahead.
I want to hear your question.
Okay, so this was one of the early questions that came in, so I just wanted to be respectful to people that were using the app and getting questions in early. And I think, we've talked about the economics of it, the national security, we've talked about the politics of it, the history of it. So this question is, how does educating children to compete in the global economy affect job creation? And I think, we could look at education as maybe even a broader, right now is looking at, do people have journalistic literacy? Do they know how to tell what is news and facts and what isn't? And we could look at the role of teaching civics, perhaps, and we could talk about an emphasis on history, maybe. So if you have any kind of idea of how educating children and how kind of bringing people up, and what would be some?
So I'll jump in as a mother of two kids. who are going to elementary school soon. So I think that's one of the core problems we have in the United States. When you have a zip code-based school system that really limits the access to good education. And where I came from, that was not the case, at least at that time. We had good public schools, regardless of average income level, right? Of course, things are changing in China too, unfortunately. There is also zip code-based school system being developed. But I think that's one of the core problems we are facing. I really think I have an important job. Though I wish I could train my students to acquire the skills, to work in Silicon Valley. I'm an economist, so I cannot train them to program. But I really think it is an important job as an educator, and it's an important job as a policymaker to provide that kind of opportunity to everybody in this country.
Very good. Let me take a quick, just to do education and do it right. The senator for Colorado that I was mentioning before was Hank Brown. And it was Hank Brown who read the WTO document, actually read it, because it's sort of an education-related thing, and who had been a supporter of it, and said, when I actually read it, I was appalled. And he came out in opposition. One of the biggest problems in trade debates and these broader debates is that we allow elites to define the range of discourse, and we tell most Americans, this is something so complex that if you don't agree with the elites, you mustn't know what you're talking about, right? This is a huge, we all know this to be the case. And so, because I don't think elites will ever change or ever get better, I think that we have a moral responsibility to educate the great mass of Americans about economics. And we do not do it. It is absolutely shameful.
Thank you for.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you. And then right up to the
Can
college.
you be our spokesperson?
Yes, and right
We've
up to
achieved
college.
unanimity on the panel on this.
But this is the critical part about it. The education about economics must not be in a business school paid for by a multinational corporation. It must be in a public university and a public school paid for by people who want informed citizens. Now, this is a big, I love your applause, but let me just finish this core concept. This is a huge deal. It's a huge deal. I've been in business schools paid for by multinational corporations, and I've been well treated. And I think that's not my point. It's not to say, oh, go away. But it is to say we cannot allow the discourse to be so narrowed in that it is whether this corporation says this or that corporation says that or that economy. This has got to, at the core, be a democracy discussion. And it's why I said at the start of this, and I know people are a little ill at ease with the use of the term irrelevant. However, I'll hold to it, because the fact of the matter is what's coming with automation is going to require the deepest, most serious economic debates this country has ever had. And they're coming very, very fast, and we are not prepared for them. And the truth of the matter is that as we merge an automation regime with a digital revolution and a globalization reality, as we merge all those things together, if we don't come out of that with a democratized approach to economics, and one that does dial down the influence of capital, if we don't get to that, then we will live in a future defined by multinational corporations that don't need us. And that becomes one of the ugliest and most disempowering realities imaginable. We need to move very, very quickly to get our heads and hands around the issue of globalization. We need to get our heads and hands around the issue of digital change. And we have to have net neutrality and all these things, but a whole lot more. And we have to get on top of this automation revolution, not to oppose the future, not to oppose it, but to say, if we're going to create a future in which there are a lot fewer jobs and a lot more that can be done by machines, isn't it time that we finally get the promise of every writer and polemicist author of the past that when we automate, when we move to this great new future, we will be able to work less and enjoy our lives more. The only way we get that is if we democratize education about the economy and ultimately if we democratize the decisions about our economy.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so in closing, we'd like to get you out of here on time. We'd like to thank the Conference on World Affairs for providing this, all of you that submitted questions, and for attending, and especially, but please, a round of applause for our wonderful panelists.
No, I'm really glad you said that about automation.
About automation, because, oh yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I think so.
When they said we're gonna,
Yes, I think so.
when they said
Yes, I think so.
when they said